When tragedy strikes, we see how a community really comes together.
One small town in Franklin County did just that when everything was virtually gone after the deadly outbreak. Kenesha Dees shares their journey from then to now.
It was really a tragic day.
Yes, I guess you could say I was tried by fire. You know, it was a breaking in period for me.
For the people of Phil Campbell, April 27, 2011 will be a day they will never forget. 27 precious lives taken in Franklin County.
Something that you don't train for or you don't really expect.
Franklin County Sheriff Shannon Oliver had just been sworn in before tragedy struck.
I took office on January the 20th, and then this happened April the 27th.
At the time, Principal Derek Riddle was then assistant principal of Phil Campbell High School. The school established in 1911. 100 years later, this school would be forever changed. The school reduced to rubble, but still served its purpose after the storm. Cell towers were down, and the campus, along with the elementary school, would serve as a central hub to account for survivors.
We put up like lists of students, grade level, and so people could come into school and say, well, I've seen this person. I know they're not injured, I know they're not hurt, and it kind of became, I guess, the communication center because, people were able to come in and say, well, I know this person's okay.
Riddle says the center was also a place for coping with the devastation.
And so to know that we could use this place as a healing center, for that tragic time, it was just good to know that people felt, like they could come here and do that and felt welcome.
The school year finished off at a local college, and for the next 3 years, students learned from 27 mobile units. They learned from churches at the beginning of the 2014-15 school year for several weeks before moving into their new home.
And we started school in 3 different churches. The year it was supposed to be done, we had to have 3 different schools. So we had like the 10th and 11th and 12th grade in this church, the 9th and 10th in this church, and the 7th and 8th in another church down the road for 7 weeks.
10 years later, leaders say the hurt still remains.
Thank gosh, that's just happened just yesterday. The sting is still as strong, and the devastation is still there. We're still trying to rebuild and recuperate.
However, there are many lessons learned. They've learned how to better prepare.
With our school now, we have actually a tornado shelter built in the school.
The shelter can hold up to 1,000 people, just around the number of those living in this town. Sheriff Oliver prays nothing like this ever happens again, but they're also prepared.
And we do some training. We've had some training based on the recovery and search efforts during something like this.
Phil Campbell also remembers the lives lost. There's a memorial at the elementary school honoring 2 students and a teacher who died. Ethan Knox, Edgar Mojica, and Patricia Gentry. Another at Phil Campbell Memorial Park remembering all who died in the county.
So every time you see it, it's just a reminder of those people made, a difference in our lives and in our community and to our friends and family as well.
And to mark 10 years, the city of Phil Campbell will remember this as well.
It's a sad day, but we don't want it to be a sad day. We want to try to, make it a positive thing if we can.
Putting the Valley first, Kenesha Dees, WZDX News.